Dark Deity 2 is here officially today, March 24th, and thanks to the developers, I was given the chance to play the game early and completely finish it and explore almost everything that it has to offer. So today, I'm here to tell you guys all about it, and for those of you who are on the fence and haven't gotten the game yet, or haven't even heard about it, you can feel free to use this video to feel things out and get a better grasp on whether or not this game is for you. There will be timestamps in the description, so feel free to jump around to what you want to hear about, or listen to the whole video. It's probably the most detailed and in-depth review I've ever written. Before I begin, a couple things to keep into perspective. I played on the deity difficulty of the game, which is what the game is balanced for. There is a demonic difficulty, but that is unbalanced and really only intended for those of you who want a tough challenge and don't have an issue with bashing your heads against the wall. I also played completely blind with no knowledge other than what was given in the very first demo back in December or so, I think, so as to give you guys as pure of a review as possible. I was also given an early review copy by the developers to get this ready, and I talk with them quite often. Despite that, I'm not going to be influenced or dishonest as it would make both me and them look bad anyways. So with that out of the way, let's talk strategy. The first thing I want to discuss in this review is the gameplay. Dark Deity 2 has changed a lot from the first game, while maintaining a somewhat similar formula. At its core, it's still a turn-based strategy RPG where you move your army and then the enemy team moves their army. However, this time around, they have far more heavily leaned into the RPG part of the strategy RPG genre, and we've got a lot of great and new customizable elements that they've brought on board. The first one you'll encounter is their equipment system, or the rings you're allowed to craft. Right out the gate, you're immediately granted access to make whatever ring you have the gems to create. In the early game, you won't have many of them, but you can earn more through completing secondary objectives on maps, leveling up your character bonds, or even straight up buying them from shops. These rings can improve characters so drastically, allowing you to make some great killing machines and even change the way you play some classes by piggybacking on certain levels of utility. I think these were fantastic additions, and the way in which we're forced to choose between what rings we want to craft and which units we want to put them on because of the limited supply of gems makes this mechanic a slam dunk for resource management. One of the big things that really make you think and forms a large component in strategy games like this is where you allocate your resources, and even into the late game you might find that you're still picking and choosing which rings you want to buy and having to prioritize some over others. Personally, I had a unit who became an absolute monster after making two very specific rings and integrating them into a strategy that I figured out, which I'll make a video on later this week, don't worry. But without those rings, that strategy becomes far less effective and, more importantly, far less fun. But no system is perfect, and while I really did like this, a lot of the rings are clearly superior to others, with many of them being quite underpowered and honestly pretty easy to ignore. I know there's no way to perfectly balance things, but having somewhere I can't even feel like I see a situation to use them is a little bit odd. Other than that, you get to deploy a party of 10 units into the late game, which means 20 ring slots, and depending on your unit variety, you may also struggle to find 20 rings that those units would even be able to make use of in the first place. I know some of my units only had one ring even into the end game, while some didn't even use or need any to begin with. I think this is an element that they can continue to build on, as equipment systems are so important in games like these where they are literal game changers, even if it was just like a small niche for each ring. And maybe I haven't had the game knowledge to figure that out yet, who knows. Another aspect of the gameplay that I really enjoyed was the fact that your choices matter. So, Dark Deity 2 has this nice thing where in the first half of the game or so, it allows you to make different choices on who you want to align yourself with. Based on the choice that you pick, it will give you different rewards and even change some of the later story scenes based on the consequences of the actions that you took. It isn't anything drastic and it doesn't cause any split paths, but it is nice to see that it isn't just a small gameplay change for flavor. The rewards can vary from straight up cash to gems and even sometimes unique weapons that you won't have the chance to get again, or non-uniques that you'd otherwise not get until much later in the game. It's a really interesting way of trying to balance your choices, both from how you see yourself aligning in the story, but also what you want gameplay-wise. There were definitely 2 or 3 of these instances where I wanted to side with someone specific for the story, or just because I like them, but then I had to make the best decision for the sake of the units I'm building, and I sat there and had to really think about what I wanted to prioritize. It was definitely an excellent feature, and the only bad thing I have to say about it is I wish there was more of it. Though I understand that at some point you have to draw a line because it's not possible from a story writing standpoint to do it so late into the game. Now, let's talk about classes. One of the most exciting things about an RPG is the way you formulate your unit building experience and watch your little baby units grow into some absolute monsters. I touched on this a little bit when I talked about the rings, but Dark Deity 2 also has quite a few combinations when it comes to classes. Every unit starts out in a beginner class of sorts, and then upgrades into a Tier 2 class at level 5, and then a Tier 3 class at level 20. Depending on your choice, it will change your class ability, your base stats, your growths, your unique class skills, and even the weapon that you use. When you upgrade into a Tier 3 class, you take forward all your prior skills that you had in your Tier 1 and Tier 2 classes, so this allows for quite a few combinations. 16, in fact, for every unit if my math's correct. One thing that isn't static, however, is the base weapon that you use. I'll talk more about the equipment system in a minute, but sometimes changing classes may have you building a totally different weapon that you will then have to try and fit into your playstyle or skill set, so it's not as smooth of a transition as it may be in some other SRPGs, where you get that weapon type as a secondary to continue to build on what you have. I don't necessarily see this as a negative, but it's something that you'd have to keep an eye on. Now, since we just talked about weapons, I guess this is the best opportunity to discuss them. There are 6 different weapon types: swords, axes, daggers, bows, relics, and focus. All characters start out with a basic weapon of each type, with the option to get stronger weapons that have different spreads of might, accuracy, crit, and weight. In addition to that, each weapon has 2 relic slots that allow you to add 2 extra active or passive skills to that weapon. These can be as simple as increasing the weapon stats by flat amounts such as might +2 or crit +15, to full-on different skills that synergize with different classes or even add on some new mechanics. I won't go too depth on these since each weapon has its own unique spread of skills most of the time, but you'll find that even within each weapon class, they can differ in the ways that they're intended to be used based on the class that uses them. For example, there may be a more powerful but heavier sword suited to a tankier class as opposed to a lighter sword with high crit and accuracy more intended for a dodge tank class. That doesn't mean you can't use the heavier sword with a dodge tank class. In fact, I did that myself. But that's part of the fun and flexibility of the system. The world is your oyster in that regard. Having said that, the one complaint I have is that I always looked forward to getting new weapons and upgrading my current one, and after a while, maybe about halfway into the game, I noticed that new weapons weren't necessarily any better than the ones that I had, and sometimes deep into the end game, the ones I was getting weren't even stronger, they were just worse. It's probably from a balance standpoint, but I felt restricted in the weapons department for a while, and there were even some that were so strong that I got so early that there was never anything after that was stronger, which I found to be kinda strange. It ended up just kind of stagnating the progress of the weapon system, and that was something that I ended up missing. Another thing that kind of bothered me was that because certain weapons have certain skills that seem to cater better towards certain classes, when you get those weapons and initially they seem like an upgrade, they end up not doing that since the additional skill you can add on just aren't as good for the class that you currently have, and so that ends up just not outweighing the benefit of the regular stats. It's hard to have universal weapons, but I think a few more middle ground ones might have been beneficial here. You'll see what I mean if you play the game, but I did enjoy the level of customization that came with the weapons, and I enjoyed making combinations work that shouldn't have in the first place. If you're thinking to yourself, man, I've never seen Link go this deep on gameplay components, well, that's because there's quite a decent amount of gameplay stuff to cover for this, and we're not even halfway through. The next part I'll talk about is the ability system. Each character will eventually have 5 abilities. The first is a unique ability that only that character will have, and the next 4 will be abilities that you gain depending on your Tier 2 and 3 classes, 2 for each one you go into. Not all abilities are made equal, but you can probably make use of most of them all the same. Each ability will require a specific amount of mana to use, which is new in Dark Deity 2. Each character starts the battle off with 100 mana, and will recover a certain amount each turn that will vary depending on class, abilities, or even the rings or weapons that you give them. Abilities can be active damage-dealing ones, support abilities, or healing abilities, and there's a wide variety of them, and each class you go into will have abilities that drastically change the way you play. Depending on your playstyle, you'll end up leaning more heavily towards specific ones. Sometimes your utility unit will only use active support skills. Sometimes your healer will just heal. And sometimes your damage dealer will just nuke continuously. They do cater to clear roles, and some skills will overlap in between the two, but for the most part, it's rather fitting, and I think they did a good job with it. One thing that I feel is actually underrated with what they did in this game was how the mana system comes into play with the upgrade system that they have. You see, each skill has 4 possible upgrades. Sometimes you can upgrade damage. Sometimes you can upgrade the range that the skill hits. Sometimes you can add an extra ability, and sometimes you can just straight up lower the mana cost. Depending on how you want your unit to play, this is yet another layer of customizability since you're only allowed to choose 2 of the 4 upgrades, and early on in the game, these upgrades are highly limited. So you'll have to choose very wisely who and where you want to invest in. The one downside to this is that once you find that unit's niche and how you want to play them, you'll really only end up using 1 or 2 of the skills since not only will it be optimal, but honestly that's all you'll really have the mana for. And not only that, some units end up being pretty useless in combat once you do use up all their mana, so you'll have to pace yourself and have them be in downtime for a chunk of the map, or figure out a way to really utilize those few uses that you do have for that unit to make the best of what they can do. Again, it'll be entirely focused on how you play the game, which is a good thing, but losing flexibility due to balancing doesn't always feel great. I like to have my units always actively engaged in something all the time, and sometimes I just didn't. Speaking of things that don't feel great, let's talk about death. Permadeath does not exist in this game. It's a mechanic that has been debated since the very beginning of time with SRPGs and when they first hit the market. Some have perfected the lack of it, like Triangle Strategy, while others have mastered it like Fire Emblem and Final Fantasy Tactics. Here, when a unit dies, they're gone for the rest of the map, but return for the next one with a penalty. These penalties are random and chosen from a variety of debuffs. Honestly, like the first game, these aren't really intrusive whatsoever. They're random, they're not permanent, and almost feels not punishing in the slightest, to the point where I was easily able to use units many times and even sacrifice them on purpose sometimes, and not be punished for it. The only times I felt the need to make sure I went deathless are maps that required it as a side objective. And even then, if the objective wasn't lucrative enough and I didn't have an issue missing it, I didn't care. I get that there are exactly 20 playable units in this game and that permadeath would make it extremely punishing, but there has to be some kind of middle ground between that and the almost negligible penalty system that they have that occurs on the following map. I don't have any bright ideas for this, honestly. I'm a fan of permadeath, but I think having the unit reset to their pre-map state in terms of EXP would be fitting here at the very least. A setback in terms of levels and stats, as well as the setback in being able to perform in the next map, would be fairly significant in my opinion, but let me know if you guys have any other suggestions. I did touch on the side objective slightly in the previous point, but I'll give it its own little analysis segment because it was something I had given them feedback about in the first game, and I'm glad they took up the mantle and decided to run with it in this one. Side objectives are fantastic. They give you something extra to do and some goals to shoot for. However, the side objectives here are actually lacking in innovation most of the time. Clear in X turns, save X amount of villagers, or don't lose any units is pretty vanilla. I think their inclusion is a positive overall, let me start with that, and the fact that it gives you extra resources makes them compelling enough, at least in the early game, that I'd consider resetting to make sure I got them all. That's how impactful it is. But once you get to the second half of the game, you're pretty much set on builds and units and investments that you're really just fine-tuning. You have enough money, enough skill enhancement materials, more than enough weapon runes, and even what you don't have, you can just buy from the shop in the camp before or after maps. At that point, they feel very optional, and I found myself ignoring them if I really didn't need them. They end up not adding to the tension or contributing in any meaningful way, and because they weren't tied to the story or something I had to really figure out while actively playing, I honestly stopped caring. There's a chapter in the second half of the story where one of our allies is under attack from an enemy. The secondary objectives is to put out some fires and save the villages, which is done by just stepping on the tile. There's no real time limit to putting out the fires, at least from what I could see, but our allies, these characters who we've interacted with for almost the entire story, until now, literally just fold and die on turn 1. And then after that are okay and come back and talk to us after the map. This was a missed opportunity to really get me to care about someone who I've had multiple encounters with and present me with a real, tangible side objective by making saving them doable but difficult. Not only does it integrate story into the gameplay, but it feels meaningful. And that feeling, I think, is what the side objectives end up lacking and turning them more into an optional and forgotten gimmick. Not to mention, some of the late game maps just don't have side objectives at all. It doesn't exist. It's a step in the right direction for sure and shows that they're thinking, but I think it needs just a little bit more fine-tuning. Another thing we need to talk about are bosses. This game does a great job of developing its main cast, which I'll get to when I start to talk about the story. But since we're about to talk about map design, one of the more important aspects here is the big bad that you run up against at the end of the map. They've done a good job at adding passive skills to general enemies and bosses to make them deadlier to your party, but one thing that I found quite lacking was, well, the lack of memorable bosses and unique mechanics. This is for two reasons. One, there are only a few bosses with actually different faces. The majority are just your average unit that is tweaked to be stronger than its peers. That second is because the combat with said bosses is as simple as stacking a bunch of passive skills to make it stronger that way and call it a day. There are a very small portion of bosses that are memorable. I can count them on one hand, and where they are, they actually do it pretty well. Without spoiling it, one of the best boss fights in the game, fittingly, is actually the final boss. It has mechanics, it's a more drawn-out fight, and it does challenge you to a certain extent. Had my team not been built in an insane way that made it near invincible, I probably would have had some trouble with it. But that fight was certainly memorable, along with a couple of other ones. Where they do it, it's done great, but most of the time it's not there, and I think that's a shame. You all know how much I love my villains, and so more of an on-map presence is something that I certainly missed. And that's my feedback here. More memorable bosses makes for more memorable maps, and with that transition, let's finally talk about map design. Dark Deity 2 has a Jekyll and Hyde map design distribution. For the first 40% of the game, I'd say, it does a fantastic job. There's pressure, the maps are unique, the objectives don't feel too samey because the ways in which you reach them are relatively unique, and you're still experimenting and learning how your own units and skills function and how to best use them. However, you end up hitting a point, and you'll feel it when you play the game, where things just click. So you stop getting taken off guard, you start knowing exactly what to expect, and the game goes on autopilot as you play. The final third of the game is particularly guilty of this, where a lot of the objectives end up being some form of escape, seize, arrive, which is a different way of saying stand on this square and end the map. And a lot of them end up being maps that you can, and probably at some points will, clear in one turn just to move on with things. There are a couple maps that I will name here for the sake of explaining positives and negatives. The first excellent map that comes to mind to me is Chapter 3, or at least the version of it that I played, where your team needs to defend for a certain amount of turns as you get pressured by enemies on both sides. This map was excellent so early into the game, because if you really wanted to get all the goodies there, you had to have quite a high level of tactical play to reach there with the units that you have at your disposal. You need to plan and split them up accordingly, while also keeping the NPCs you're supposed to be protecting safe. I loved this map, and I found it to be a challenge to get everything, and it was actually the first time I ended up not killing a boss or getting all the objectives. Another chapter that follows it that was great was a bar fight chapter where you have to work your way through a massive group of enemies while tossing out drinks at them that impede the movement of both you and the enemies. There's a lot of spare loot around, and to get to it, you really need to move on the faster end and run the risk of running into too many enemies. This map was also excellent because it keeps the constant pressure both on you getting attacked and you wanting to push forward. The last one I'll mention here is actually an escort chapter that is in Fog of War. I loved this one because, despite it being a divisive Fog of War map, it was a fair one. Enemies constantly popped out at you from the fog. You also needed to keep the NPCs you're escorting safe, and to add to that, if you did it deathless, you also got the extra side objective. This one was a lot of fun because it was challenging, and I loved every bit of it. Now, as for the stinkers, there are a few, but one that particularly comes to mind is a prison break chapter late into the game. There's nothing special about this chapter design in the slightest. There's no pressure, there's no interesting gimmick, and to make it worse, if you want to teleport across the map and hit the escape tile on turn 1, you can do exactly that, which makes zero sense to begin with for an escape chapter. There's also a stretch of a few chapters late game which are just you trudging through enemies and seize or defeat boss maps that overstay their welcome and feel like just one prolonged road to finish off the story and give characters a bit of extra development between maps. I'd have honestly rathered the fat be trimmed by 4 to 5 chapters and have longer story segments in between the ones prior to that. I think my biggest thing here is that when they do focus on the quality, their maps are compact and very fun to play, but the lack of consistency there hurts a bit from a gameplay perspective because it can feel like it drags, especially, once again, in the final third of the game where your units end up getting pretty cracked. One honorable mention, though, is their challenge maps. Some of those were great, and you aren't allowed to bring that many units. I enjoyed quite a few of them, especially the desert one where you can only bring Gwyn and 2 supporters. That was a tough one. And of course, it wouldn't be a map design discussion without talking about enemy variety. After you've played a few chapters in Dark Deity, you've basically seen every enemy type that you ever will for the rest of the game. The monster types are all the same, the human enemies are all the same, they get stronger and beefier, but that's about it. They don't promote, they don't change shape, they don't act differently, which does make fighting those enemies on the map feel solved at points, since you know them so well and they won't really do anything different. Once you fight it 100 times, the witch is always going to be annoying, but you eventually know how to deal with it. I personally would have loved to see the enemies vary just a bit more, even if just visually, to indicate that now they're stronger. I also wouldn't have minded if some of our classes were used for enemy classes and vice versa, since there's a segregation between enemies can be and what we can be. I don't think crossover is bad, and it would create that sense of variety. Now, I've touched on this in various segments, but I think the one thing I do want to emphasize on in terms of the gameplay is the best aspect of this game, and that is the flexibility. I touched on it a bit in the skill section, and I absolutely want to give it its due diligence because I love what they've done. You get a lot of flexibility to build your classes and units, and every single unit is viable in almost every single class they have access to. Do you want to turn your unit into a tank? Go right ahead. The tools to do that are available. Will it be the most efficient? Not really, but you can do it, and it can work because you can patch up the deficiencies with a ring or a weapon that is customized correctly, or even by making use of certain skills. The system itself really does shine, and the abilities integrated with that all are pretty unique and fantastic. I have very few complaints about this, except that some of the classes end up being clearly better than the others, so much so that I question why I'd even go into one over the other. And just to be clear, this is totally a personal choice and gameplay style kind of thing. I like to be hyper aggressive and have some invincible units that don't need much in the way of support and can overextend without getting too punished, and I get to do that. If you prefer a DPS mage that hits from the back lines, you can probably find a way in which I wasn't able to make it work. Support classes are all pretty useful, and there are one or two that really stand out, the one that warps and the one that dances. And between those two, you don't really need more than that, and the fact that you can put as many units as can access those classes into them, you may end up with half your team there, with the other half being nukers. And you get to do that. You get to decide what your distribution is. Personally, I did my best to keep a variety so I can review this game more honestly, but at the end of that, there are two types of classes that ended up standing out to me. I wasn't able to make use of things like pure high defense tanks, even though I do have some ideas for it, but I probably could if I put my mind to it because, again, the customization and flexibility is so deep. It's incredibly hard to make that balance. But I think they did a good job of making maps vary with what type of enemy they throw at you so that some methods of playing end up shining more than others depending on the map. And again, it really does give you that somewhat sandbox kind of feel where you can do whatever you want. Ooh, alright, deep breath. I think that's enough talking about gameplay elements, isn't it? I don't know if I can really do it any more justice than that, but definitely let me know what your thoughts are below about all the individual elements that we have to play here. Let's take a breath of fresh air and talk about something a bit more lighthearted, like music. The music in this game is actually pretty good. I don't exactly have a high bar for music, but when even I can remember the tune of the main theme, or of some of the map themes, that's usually a pretty good indication that they did something right. In addition to that, I think the music that goes alongside some of the story segments is quite well done. They have a few bangers. Their final map theme goes hard, for example, and their main theme is actually great too. I really like it. I enjoyed what they've done with the music, and I hope they keep pushing it to be more and more impactful as well moving forward. Not much to say here, unfortunately, since I'm not the most musically inclined person, but for the average Joe musical ear like me, I say carry on. I don't really have any complaints here. In terms of artistic design, let me tell you, they've leveled up from the first game. Those of you who've played it may have seen some images of the map art that circled around that got a lot of hate, but now their pixel art map looks fantastic and was really nice to see, so much so that in the previous thumbnail, I just let the map background be there since I liked how it looked. The character designs are consistent from the first game and look crisp and great in both portraits and critical poses. They have a bunch of very nicely drawn out CGs in the story that really shine when you see them integrate wonderfully into the storytelling that you'll pause and really look at it when it happens. The animations are also excellent. I think that was probably the best part of the first game, and I'm glad to see that they've gotten even better here. Really stellar job by the animators in doing all of these between the ally classes and even the enemies. I loved almost every single one, except maybe when I had to upgrade from Blood Mage to Hemomancer for one of my units. It was just a personal favorite sprite of mine, so I was kind of sad to lose it, but otherwise, S-tier animation all around. Absolutely no complaints here. They did a phenomenal job. One last thing to talk about in this sort of mini segment is the voice acting. Dark Deity 2 surprised us and brings its A game with a fully voiced acted story. As a collective, I think all of the voice actors did a wonderful job, and their director returns from the first game to do an even better job with the casting. Not all the roles leave a notable impact, given that not everyone has as big as a presence in the story from a longevity perspective, but when an NPC demon that only shows up in one chapter puts up such a legendary performance that even I have to sit there, pause the game, and message the developers about this, you know they've done an amazing job.
A demon who sucks upon fat man's spine. That like pigs. Come, mortals. Come, man-spun. Grant me succor. Release me from this prison.
Damn it, why are we wasting time talking to this thing? You want release, big guy? We'll give you some. The hard way.
Hate to say it, but Reardon's right. We came here to cleanse the corruption, not to chat with it.
Gwyn, there are some foes too great even for you. Stand down or you'll get us all killed.
Uncle, nobody else can.
And man, there's a scene in the late game with a specific character that goes so hard, it sent literal chills down my spine for how good that monologue was. The pure rage, agony, and borderline insanity was so well done that, man, I'm so glad I have that recorded so I can just experience it all over again. Of course, not all of them are serious, and you have your well-done goofy characters too, and they all have their nice moments. But most importantly is the main cast, because they're the ones who you're going to hear over and over again. And I think Gwyn's voice actress in particular did a fantastic job with portraying her early optimism, and then her struggles through the story to make the right choices, as well as her dealing with the consequences as the story progresses. The uncertainty, the anger, the desire for revenge sometimes, and even the sadness all go very well with how she was written. It helps bring these characters to life, which is exactly what you want from the voice acting. I think that was all pretty well done and spot on. My only complaint is that I didn't get to see some of my personal favorites a little bit more, looking at you, Cassandra. But I understand that not everyone can be written into the story as deeply, and that's not really a voice acting criticism, so I guess I'll just jump to talking about the story. I suppose I should preface this by saying, I won't say any major spoilers in this segment. All I'll do is line up the setting for what I'm about to talk about, and then I'll be fairly vague for the rest of it. The world of Dark Deity 2 takes place in the same realm as Dark Deity 1, just on a different continent. Our main character, Gwyn, is the daughter of the hero of the first game, Irving, who himself is now the leader of a large organization that seeks to keep the world at peace. His closest friend, Alden, who we also know from the first game, is here with him and serves as a mentor to Irving's 3 children, Gwyn, Reardon, and Arthur. The game starts off with Gwyn following in her father's footsteps as a member of his order and being sent on missions to various races and countries in order to solve issues and form alliances, with the looming threat of war in the background from an evil king that seeks to rule all. We follow her adventure as she maneuvers the many conflicts of this continent and her mission to figure out what's right and who is right in an ever-evolving story that may not be as straightforward as it seems. Let's start off with keeping this simple. If you've played the first game, or even watched my first review of it, you'll know that I was very harsh on the story there. It was straight up bad, and there wasn't really a way for me to sugarcoat it or even be nice about it. In contrast, Dark Deity 2 actually gives me stuff to talk about. It immediately establishes a tone. It tells you who your main characters are, what their objectives are, and within a few chapters establishes who the antagonists are that you'll be playing political tug-of-war with throughout the entire game. To dive a little deeper, the story is basically split into a series of arcs. each having a 2 to 3 chapter sequence that follows our main group's mission to go seek out a location and resolve a conflict there to create allies and build an army. This goes on for over half the game, and while some of the maps and gameplay associated with it is quite fun, it ends up creating an odd sense of confusion as to what is really going on. A lot of these characters are on the screen for those 2 chapters and then never again until very late in the game, where they may or may not resurface to say something plot relevant, and it feels a little bit fragmented and directionless. Granted, the choices you make during these arcs are relevant and do come back to give story relevance later on into the game, which is a really nice touch, but I'm not quite sure it outweighs the separated nature of the story. One positive I will say is that each of these trials gives us insight into our main characters separately through it, and while the overarching story itself might be split into arcs, it does carry an element of linearity and continuity in the character progression of the 3 children, and that I enjoyed very much. The latter third of the story, where everything seems to start coming together, is also quite interesting because we have a shift from a gameplay-focused group of segments that have a bit of story and context in between, to far longer story segments with repetitive and less well-designed maps, as I noted in the previous gameplay section. Here we end up getting far longer sequences of story, character development, and insight into the villains and what they're up to. The detail in the story increases, and instead of telling a story through gameplay, it begins to feel like we're telling the story with gameplay stuck in between there to give us a break. I would have much rather seen the story more evenly distributed throughout the earlier half, but given the way it was structured, I can see why they did it this way. Ultimately, I think it's no secret that, like its predecessor before it, Dark Deity 2 is setting up for a sequel. Given that, I think it's pretty fair to say that you will finish the story with questions that will go unanswered. And unfortunately for them, I think there might have been a little bit too many questions that went unanswered than there really should have. I don't like using the word frustrated a lot because it's associated with a lot of negative connotations, but the closer I got to the end of the game, the more frustration I had because these minor details that they tossed at me in Chapter 5 and Chapter 12 and Chapter 21 were still not answered. And then the game ended and I was like, huh? At the end of the day, they do justify this with a sequel to come, but it does leave quite an empty feeling, almost as if you've played through a story teaser. Now, to flip this on its head, this could definitely be taken as a positive because while they don't answer your questions, they do successfully create a lot of intrigue around their characters, world, and lore, and I think this is an excellent base to build on, so I'm excited to see how they take it and run with it for their next installment. And of course, it wouldn't be a Linking 7 review without me talking about the villains, so let's touch on them. In my interview with Chip a while ago, I asked him a very important question about villains and whether or not they classify into ones you just hate because they're evil, and ones you hate because they're morally gray. He told me there was a bit of both, and having played the game now, I can see what he was going for, but I can't say that it left me completely pleased. Again, I really don't want to spoil this, so I won't go into too much detail, but some of their villains can be as cartoony as can be with a rule-the-world type of attitude, while others end up being this oddball of back-and-forth development that then ends in a see you next time on Dragon Ball Z where we'll finish my development in the next game sort of deal. And I think this would work if you had a larger and more focused antagonistic cast to support that sort of in between the lines of writing, but they don't. The political intrigue also being split by the arcs and coming together at once was nice when it did, but it quickly falls apart and we don't end up seeing them reunite on a larger scale again. Some come back depending on the choices that you make, but it isn't this grand political story that I feel like they tried to go for and didn't completely resolve or accomplish. Again, maybe this is setting up for the second game, so I can't judge it just yet, unfortunately, but with what I have, that's sort of my opinion. I think it's all a setup, and that seems to be the theme of the game. It's Season 2 Part 1, and won't really make sense until Season 2 Part 2. As a standalone game, it works fine, but it's simple, and leaves you with more questions than answers. As for our main cast, I do think they did an excellent job with Irving. He is by far, in a way, the most well-developed character in this game, especially given the context of who he was in the first game. The writer did an excellent job of encapsulating not only post-war guilt, but also the burden of having the title of hero on his shoulders and constantly having to try to live up to that. We always tell stories about saving the world, but we don't always tell stories about how it feels after you've done that and what you go through. And I think that is fantastic that they did this. Really, really beautiful. I genuinely loved the way that they handled Irving. Even if you didn't play the first game, you'd almost instantly understand what he went through by just listening to him speak in this game. Likewise, his daughter Gwyn also goes through some similar growing pains, albeit she's someone far younger and much less mature, and so her emotions have a larger spectrum, as does her development. It almost feels like they wrote Gwyn as what they kind of wanted Irving to be in the first game, and I think that shows growth. The rest of the characters don't develop too much, with Reardon and Arthur getting a fair bit as they're part of your main crew, but outside of that, the rest are confined within their arcs as stated previously. It's a shame, since the minute you start to feel like you understand that character, their story is over, and most of the time they just don't come back at all. The one thing that does help are the bond conversations that you're able to get and level up through having these characters fight together in proximity on maps. They're not really that hard to level, but completely dependent on them fighting near each other, which may not work depending on how your team comp ends up being. I kind of ignored this mechanic for the most part and only read the conversations that popped up for me naturally, and there weren't really that many of them because I didn't use every unit all the time. Honestly, these conversations didn't really stick out that much. I think the only one I can even remember well enough was the one between Saxon and Cassandra and how they talk about them both being outsiders and dealing with the fact that they're different and sort of where they come from and what their home is about. It's decent writing, but nothing that blows your socks off and gives any crazy development to these characters. If you want to know more about your characters, it's a fun little bit of bonus content that gives you gems and lets you make more rings, and I guess some cash on the side, and gives you a little bit of insight into these units. Alright, so we're finally at the end of this review, and time to come up with a final verdict. So, as I usually do, I'll summarize things. This is probably the longest and most detailed review I've done, but I wanted to do this game and the developers justice for their second time around since they tried so hard to make a good product. And I think they did. This game was incredibly fun to play. The story was easy enough to follow with some good beats and character development and even a plot twist or two. The gameplay was deep and well built with no performance issues and only a couple of bugs that I encounter, but I've been assured that they're already fixed because I reported them immediately. There are a couple things that need to be fine-tuned, but overall, for an indie game that is going to launch at $20, I absolutely think you're going to get the bang for your buck with a 30 to 35 hour experience that you will more often than not enjoy playing. Despite some stagnation in the gameplay in the last third of the game, which leads to it feeling drawn out, it does give you many avenues to enhance your experience through customizability to keep it fresh. There's also a large replayability factor in the customizable modes they've allowed us to use, and if their well-built Deity difficulty is too easy for you, and it's likely to be if you're a genre veteran, you're free to try out the overly challenging demonic mode instead. They gave you that option. Overall, there are a lot of positives and negatives with a game like this, but I think the elevation in their quality and polish since the first game is astronomical, and that alone deserves praise. They've listened to community feedback and rigorously tested their game this time around, and it shows. I think if they touch up on some of the things I mentioned in my review and take that home for their third game, we may really see a truly amazing experience, especially given all the story points they need to close. At this point, I think it's fair to give this game about a 7.5 or so out of 10. As for answering the should you buy question, I think I feel pretty good about recommending this game to any SRPG fan who wants something to play on the side. If you're still on the fence after all this, give their demo a shot and see what you think. Having said all that, I think I've talked enough for today. I've been sitting in front of this microphone for a while, but feel free to leave your opinion in the comments below to let me know what you think, and I hope I'll see you guys in another video very soon. Peace.